All right, guys, this is the kind of a review video of the notes that we've gone over during our class meetings. And I'll cover this kind of quickly, but I'll cover the things that we mentioned in class. Hopefully it'll jar your memory. Of course, if you have any specific questions, you can email me or let me know. So we start talking about this idea of compromise and how important it is in politics. Whether we're talking today or back in 1787, it's extremely important. You give up a little bit what you want, the other side gives up some of what they want, and you kind of meet in the middle. And that's how things are done in government generally, right? We don't have a king to dictate things. We have to have everybody involved, and when that is the process, you got to get compromise in there or it won't work. So keep that in mind. And hopefully you've been writing about compromise for their 1-point paragraph question for the quiz. So let's remember that in 1786, 87, during that winter time up in Massachusetts, there had been a rebellion. The farmers didn't want to pay taxes, and it was kind of a crazy time up there, and there was no one who could put down the rebellion. The governor tried, and he would eventually succeed, but there was no president. There was no federal government to ask for help. The Congress at the time, under the Articles of Confederation, was really weak. So kind of was a wake-up call for America. Like, what if this thing had gotten bigger? What if this rebellion had gotten bigger and crazier? What would happen? We needed a stronger government. That's what a lot of people felt at the time. Not everybody felt that way, but a lot of important people did, like George Washington. When George Washington takes notice of this event up in Massachusetts, it's a big deal, right? He's generally, he retired, he went to his farm in Virginia. He's not going to think about being in the spotlight anymore, but now this kind of stuff up in Massachusetts, makes him come out of retirement. He writes this letter, and you'll see a part of it there on your screen, to his friend Henry Knox. Basically, it'll lead to anarchy and confusion if we can't enforce our laws. George Washington is worried. And so he and people like Ben Franklin get all of the states to agree that maybe we should have a meeting. And the main issue really was in 1787 at this meeting, do you fix the Articles of Confederation, make them stronger, or do you just scrap the Articles of Confederation and come up with a brand new plan? And of course we know that they decided to come up with something new. So the Articles of Confederation lasted about 7 or so years, but they're out. And they're going to come up with something new. So America will get a new government now, okay? A new rule book for the nation of these 13 states that will eventually grow to 50. So they have a convention. Remember, a convention is just a big meeting. They go back to Philadelphia, the same building where they wrote the Declaration of Independence. They're going to write this Constitution from starting in May and ending in September. So basically all summer long, these delegates, 55 of them, from all of the colonies except for Rhode Island, will meet in Philadelphia. Some old, some young, most in the middle. The oldest, Ben Franklin, he's 81. And the youngest is a guy named Jonathan Dayton. He's 26. These people, you're not very diverse, right? I mean, it's basically all white men, but they were brilliant. They weren't perfect, but they were very smart. And they wanted to come up with a system. They knew it wouldn't be perfect, but they wanted to come up with a system, a government rule book that would make America strong enough, but not too strong. So people who were scared of a king might be willing to accept this if the government, this Constitution, had limited powers for president and a Congress and a Supreme Court. So it's very secretive, right? They locked all the doors and windows. There's no air conditioning. Everybody's wearing like their powdered wigs and turtlenecks and jackets. It would have been very smelly. And they wanted to keep it secretive, though, so that delegates could be free to change their mind. They wouldn't cause a panic if the country found out what they were doing inside this hall in Philadelphia. So they meet all summer, and it's important to know who was there, right? We've talked about this in class. George Washington, he's the president of the meeting, and he adds a certain level of gravity. Like, everyone understands this is a big deal if George Washington is willing to come and be part of it and be president of the meeting. James Madison is a young lawyer from Virginia. He's going to be considered the father of this Constitution. He's going to do so much of the writing, and he's brilliant, and he'll go on to be president. Not perfect, but he knows a lot about this stuff. Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, and Roger Sherman would be delegates that are there. Roger Sherman is Not very famous, but he is now, right? You remember he is the only person to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution that they write in Philadelphia during this convention time in 1787. But who's not there? John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. They're not even in the country. So not every founding father was part of the Constitutional Convention. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, they knew what was happening through letters. They would offer their opinions through letters, but they were not physically present at the convention. So when these delegates come, the 55 men, they come with their plans, right? The Virginia plan. That's the plan for basically letting the big states with the most population have the most say in government. Edmund Randolph and the others from Virginia, they want states like Virginia that have a lot of people to have more say in this new government. So they want a two-house legislature. They actually want a president, but that president would be chosen by the legislature. Another word for legislature is Congress, right? Legislature means the part of our government that writes the laws. So the Congress would choose the president. They wanted a lower house. We'd call it the House of Representatives. That would be chosen by the people. And the upper house, we'd call that the Senate. That would be chosen by the lower house. So this whole Congress is really based on the idea that the more people a state has, the more representatives they would have in their Congress. Therefore, more say in their government. All of this is based on population. And we talked about how small states would never go for this, right? But if the big state said, this is the way it is, the small states would have left. We have to find a compromise. The small states like New Jersey come with their own plan. Let's keep Congress one house, but every state is equal. So New Jersey has just as much say as New York or as Massachusetts. Connecticut has just as much say as Pennsylvania. But again, if the small states would have pushed this too hard, the big states would have said, you guys, we're leaving. We're going to form our own country. So in order for these 13 states, well, 12 if Rhode Island wasn't there, but the idea was that Rhode Island would probably join if something was passed. How would we get these states to marry each other? Right? That's what we're talking about here. Them coming together in a marriage. And they're so different. Big states, small states, slave states, free states. How would it work? These two plans show that these states, big states, small states, had different ideas of what they wanted. Of course, we've learned that politics is compromise. So what's known as the Great Compromise, Roger Sherman from Connecticut comes up with this idea. Basically, it blends both of the two plans. We would have a two-house legislature, a Congress. The lower house, the House of Representatives, would be based on population and picked by the people. And the upper house would have two senators from every state, no matter how big or how small. So states like Connecticut, even though it may have smaller population, has just as much say in government and the government of the United States as New York, who had lots of people. And so this is what we have today. This is in the Constitution. We have the House of Representatives that's based on population. California and Florida, New York, Texas, they have more people, so they have more representatives. States like Wyoming, they only have one, so they would be outvoted all the time in the House of Representatives. They still have some say, but they're not as important as the big states. However, in the Senate, Wyoming has two senators. So does California. They have the same amount of power in the Senate. So if you look at this slide with the U.S. Capitol building, you can see that it's very symmetrical, right? But on the left would be the Senate side. That's where they meet. And on the right side of the dome, that's where the House of Representatives meet. So two separate houses, part of one Congress. The House of Representatives based on population. Big states have the power. The Senate is based on the idea that every state is equal. Two states, or two senators for every state. So Ohio has two, Florida has two, Oklahoma has two. Everybody's equal there. But what comes up when they're dealing with this compromise is, what about slavery? Okay, so if we're going to base the House of Representatives on the number of people living in a state, are we going to count the slaves? Well, of course, the southern states say, yeah, count the slaves, because that would mean we would have more people. That would mean we would have more representatives in the House of Representatives. That would mean we would have more power in government. The northern states say, slow down. Come on, you never think of slaves as people. You think of them as property. And now, when we're forming a new government, you want to count your slaves as people? And so there's a lot of back and forth. Now, we mentioned in class, if the northern states would have said, hey, no slavery in this new country, this new government that we're forming, the southern states would have left. There would have been no country. They had to work out some deal. And what they work out is considered the most odious, meaning the smelliest, the worst, the most terrible thing you can imagine. But they had to come up with something if they were going to marry the slave states with the free states. And that's known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. So for every 5 slaves, they will count as 3 people. So in other words, if I count 10 slaves, that's 6 people. If I count 100 slaves, that's 60 people. So it's terrible, but it's what they came up with. Another way of looking at it is that every slave is 3/5 of a person. So now you are 5/5 of a person. But a slave back then, written into the Constitution, would be more than half, but not quite a whole, right? So you can figure out the decimal, divide 3 by 5, and you'll figure out what percentage the people who wrote the Constitution agreed on that a slave would be. Again, the North, they didn't want this, but if they didn't come up with some kind of a compromise, the country wouldn't agree and wouldn't exist, and the southern states would have left. They also decided that slave trade will only go on for about 20 more years. So boats from Africa bringing slaves in could go for 20 years. After that, they would just have to have slave trade with inside the United States. And of course, the idea is that slaves would reproduce. But again, a slave baby that's born in Georgia would only be 3/5 of a human, according to our Constitution. So, of course, today we've changed this. We've made slavery unconstitutional. But in the very beginning, it was written into the Constitution. This was something that this idea of 3/5 of a person was something the South could agree with, and the North accepted while they didn't like it, but they knew they had to come up with something, some common ground. And remember, compromises aren't necessarily good or bad. They're just a thing, part of government. Most agree today this was terrible. So by the time the convention ends in September of 1787, 39 of the 55 men sign it. So that means that some didn't like it. Some wouldn't sign it. They thought it was the president, the powers that they gave the president were too much. Or maybe they didn't like how long the president served. Or maybe they didn't like how long a senator served. They didn't like something about it, and they agreed they weren't going to sign it. But 39 did, and that was enough to get it sent off to the states. And the states now had to agree on whether or not they wanted to be in this marriage. So every state would vote on it. By 1790, all the states had accepted it. A word we sometimes use is ratified it. All the states had agreed by 1790 to accept the new Constitution as the rule book. It's not perfect. No one thought it was perfect, but it was better, they thought, than the Articles of Confederation. And they hoped that it would get this country through, like it would be a good enough government for the United States so that the United States could go on being a country. So we'll talk more about the states accepting it and the first presidential election soon, but we have to kind of dive into what the Constitution says. So we'll do that over the next couple weeks, what it says about president and Congress and the Supreme Court.